So, the villains in My Hero Academia may be the most sympathetic villains we've had in recent shonen manga. People love them so much that they would defend pretty much all of their actions and say that they were just misunderstood. And while that can be the case for some of the villains, this can't apply to all of them, which got me thinking about redemption and how it's used in the story of My Hero Academia. And one question always pops in my head, and it's that, should the villains be redeemed? That is what we're going to be talking about in this video. We're going to be talking about the redemption of the villains in My Hero Academia and whether or not they actually were redeemed. Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Manga Man Drew, and I'm here to do a video about the villains of My Hero Academia. And more specifically, I want to talk about if the villains in My Hero Academia could, should, and were redeemed at the end of their respective stories. Because the villains are probably some of the most popular characters in My Hero Academia, not including the main cast of the heroes. And there are some differing opinions on how you should feel about the villains and whether or not you should feel as sympathetic for them as you do. I will not talking about whether or not they are sympathetic, but I will talk about the redemption involving the villains in My Hero Academia. So, let's just really dive into it and really talk about what it means to be redeemed in My Hero Academia. And first off, we need to tackle what does it mean to be redeemed. And going from Webster, it says that to be redeemed can mean to atone for or to offset the bad effect of certain actions. It can mean a change for the better or to free you from consequences of sin. These are very similar in meaning for what redemption is, but in more a literature term, redemption, and by extension a redemption arc, is when a character changes and has a personal growth by overcoming their flaws and failures, wicked actions, or sins committed in a story. And through redemption, a character will do more than just seek out forgiveness, but atone for their actions or past, make a great sacrifice, and or completely switch to the side of good or heroic. And when it comes to many characters in My Hero Academia that have gone through redemption or redemption arcs, you have characters such as Bakugo with his treatment of Deku, and Endeavor and the entire Todoroki family subplot. And we've seen that these heroes have gone through redemptions as well as redemption arcs because they change as characters and become either more heroic or good, but also learn, change, and grow from their flaws and their sins, while also seeking out not necessarily forgiveness, but atonement. And while we do see it a lot for the heroes, do we see any of this redemption for the villains of My Hero Academia? And to really tackle that question, we need to tackle 3 other questions that I'll be posing in this video for all of the major villains that played a major role or were a part of the final act of My Hero Academia. And before I go over the 3 questions, I will briefly go over the criteria of villains that I will be bringing up in this video. First of all, I will be talking about villains from the main villains of the story post the Paranormal Liberation War, aka the final act of My Hero Academia. This is mainly because the villains in the final act are typically fully fleshed out characters. So I will also be tackling dynamic and rounded characters where we know a lot about their backstory, their motives, their personality, and their history. So as well as tackling villains who are dynamic and rounded characters, I also want the villains to have appeared prior to the final act beginning. I also want the villains to have appeared prior to the beginning of the final act. So no new villains introduced within the final act will be counted. Also, the villains would either need to have a prominent role or be a reoccurring villain in the plot or story in the final act, or have been a major character prior. There's only really one exception to the rule, but you will understand why when we get to that character. And I will be going in a pseudo chronological order, but focusing on where they may or may not have their major battles and moments within the final arc. And now to the questions. I will be discussing these 3 questions when it comes to the villains in order and discussing my reasoning for why I answered them for each of these villains. And the questions are: 1. Should the villain be redeemed? This is very straightforward. This question is to pretty much understand whether or not the villain deserves redemption. Question 2. Could the villain be redeemed? Basically, is there a way in story for the character to have a redemption arc? I will try to keep headcanon to a minimum and try to focus on how the story itself was structured and whether or not there was a path that could have led to a redemption or a redemption arc. And third, another straightforward question, were the characters redeemed? This is simple yet effective to know if the villain changed and became heroic or good by the end of this superhero story. And without the way, let's talk about the exception, which is Twice, aka Jin Bubagawara. And while he technically did appear in the final act in flashback form and his involvement with Toga, unfortunately he was eliminated before the actual final arc began, or the final act began. However, he was a major character in the story of My Hero Academia and was a part of the major League of Villains villain team that played a critical and prominent role in the story from beginning to end, so I think it would be fair to include him in this discussion. So, to start off, should he have been redeemed? And I think that pretty much everyone can agree with me when I say yes, it would have been good for him to have been redeemed. Because Twice was a good individual, even though he was having a life that battered him down and did not give him a real chance to become a good person like the heroes. Life treated him badly, and even Hawks recognized that Jin was a good person and that he wanted to help him, which leads into the second question, could the villain be redeemed? And I would say yes, but really no. While there is a path that Twice could have taken that could have led him down a redemption arc, the issue very much dives into who the character of Twice was and why that character redemption arc could not have worked for him. Because when it comes to Twice, while yes, there is a path where he could have taken to be redeemed by the fact that Hawks was there to help him and guide him down a different path, the difficulty comes from who the character of Twice is, which leads into, was the character redeemed? No. The reason why he couldn't go down the path of being redeemed is because he died unchanged and still held with the beliefs of being a villain. He had many hallmarks of a redemption, but the choice to support the villains to the very end was very much within his character to do so, but also meant that he was unable to go down a path of redemption. So yeah, you can see that when it comes to whether or not the villains should, could, or can, or were redeemed, is a little bit nuanced, and that's the reason why I want to include Jin into this, because he is a character when it comes to redemption with more nuances than just sympathy. But then there's Muscular, where there is no nuance whatsoever. Because to put it simply, should he be redeemed? Could he be redeemed? And was he redeemed? All the answers are no, no, and oh hell no. Because when it comes to the character of Muscular, he wanted to do what he wanted, but he did it for the thrill of it. He killed because he can and he wanted to. He showed no remorse for the deaths and the lives that he has taken, and he actively goes out of his way to hurt people even if they don't want to be involved with him. He was a horrible person, he didn't change, and didn't deserve, nor was he redeemed towards the end of the series. But speaking on Muscular, there is a villain in the story of My Hero Academia that I would argue does get redeemed, and that is Lady Nagant. And to put it simply, she get yeses in all three questions. Should the villain of Lady Nagant been redeemed? Yes. She was manipulated to do horrible things by the former head of the Hero Public Safety Commission, and it was all under the pretenses of creating a, quote, better society. And this ties into the could she be redeemed, which is also yes, because we began to see her change from that mentality. While she was initially seen as a villain, after her interactions with Deku, she began to change her mindset. And by this change of mindset, it led to her participating in two different acts of sacrifices that showed that she was willing to, at the very least, atone for her sins, especially with the end of the series choice of her staying in prison as a pseudo form of atonement, as well as just her not feeling comfortable going back into hero society. Which answers the final question, was she redeemed? Most definitely, yes. because she helped the heroes along the way to actually participate and defeat the villains such as All For One and Tomura Shigaraki, and by doing so began to change and understand what she needs to do to be a better person. And even when given the opportunity to leave and to not act, she actively chose to participate and become a hero once again. So yeah, we're getting to see that when it comes to why the people of the fandom love the villains of My Hero Academia, you can see that they are very diverse when it comes to whether or not they are sympathetic or not, and whether that sympatheticness can affect them being redeemed. Until you get to Overhaul, which could Overhaul have been redeemed? No, could not be redeemed. He should not be redeemed, and he was straight up not redeemed. So it's straight nose down the board. And let's just go over the things that he did to the heroes and the main cast that would prevent his redemption. Let's start with, he attempted to kill Deku, he abused, manipulated, and tortured Eri, he actively and actually killed Night Eye, he created quirky racing bullets from a child's Eri's blood, and he did all of this and did not feel sorry for it even after his father figure was revived. And the father figure quite literally said that he's going to dedicate the rest of his life so that Overhaul doesn't forget what he did, and that he will make sure that he takes accountability for what he did. Oh yeah, he literally put his dad in a coma. So yeah, the actions that he did and the fact that he refused to change even at the end is proof that no, he could not be redeemed, no, he should not be redeemed, and no, he was not redeemed. But you know what? Maybe this is the last villain that we're going to be talking about that has nosed straight down the board. And going into the next villain that we're going to be talking about, let's talk about Dr. Garaki. Second verse, same as the first. Man loved All For One and did his very evil bidding. He turned people into living corpses, which potentially included his own grandson. He helped Tomura Shigaraki almost kill and destroy the entire world. And worst of all, he used his influence as a doctor to abduct quirks from the elderly and children through orphanages and retirement homes. Like, no. He is almost as bad, if not worse than Overhaul. So it's no for should, could, would when it comes to redemption. I don't care if they're using his technology and his findings to help cure the Nomu or to help progress society. He was still a horrible person. But okay. Now we're actually getting to someone, or actually two people with not that much screen time in the story when it comes to their history as well as like their personalities and whatnot, but still were somewhat crucial within the final act, and that is both Giran and Mr. Compress. And here's where we're getting a little bit more complexity with whether or not they should, could, or were redeemed. And started with Giran. Should he be redeemed? I think yes. Because from what we've seen with the story, he technically did not commit any major crimes until you include joining the League of Villains or the Paranormal Liberation Front. But even then, we see why he even got in contact with Dr. Doofenshmirtz. I mean, Redemmed. Because we learned that he was a part of the Himura bloodline, we learned that he was almost sold into slavery or into servitude, very similar to what happened with Ray, and that he was basically abandoned by his family but was taken up and raised by Redemmed. So yeah, him being this victim of the hero society very much allows him to go down the process of should he be redeemed. But could he be redeemed? No, because unlike the other villains, there was no prominence enough for him to have a set path for redemption. Like I said, we only learned a lot more about Giran towards the end of the story, and before that, he was just this lackey for Redemmed on a villain side fighting against the other villains. And we don't necessarily see enough of him to say that he has changed his ways, even with his conversation with Mr. Compress. Which leads into the idea of, was he redeemed? No. Like I said, we do not see any type of change or redemption or atonement for the actions that he'd taken towards the end of the series and with his conversation with Mr. Compress. Talking about Mr. Compress, he's very much in a similar boat. When it comes to the should and could when it comes to redemption, however, I would say both of those are a yes. The reasoning why he became a villain was because he was the son of one of the greatest thieves in the world of My Hero Academia, and we also see that he was a caring person willing to sacrifice his life for his friend. Now, they were villains, but he still considered them friends. He was put into a position that he had no say in whatsoever. And even then, with the could he be redeemed? Yes, but also very much falling in line with Gen. He still did horrible things. He took the lives of many heroes and many people, or extremely maimed characters. Obviously, not to the same extent as the other villains that we're going to be talking about later, but he still was a part of a terrorist organization. But even then, we really don't see a path for him where he could have actively changed. The last time that we see Mr. Compress, he's reading a book on Spinner, which is very nice, but we'll get to Spinner soon enough. But the fact that he's reading a book about Spinner and smiling really shows that he still cares about the villains, but we still don't know how much change he has gone through. Which leads to, was he even redeemed? The answer to the question is no. Because after his imprisonment, we really don't see him making any changes whatsoever. He made a sacrifice, sure, but he really didn't grow or change and is still, relatively speaking, a villain. And going from Compress, we can also start talking about Spinner. And this is a little bit more straightforward than other villains that we've talked about. So, should Spinner have been redeemed? Actually, no. Among all of the League of Villain members, Spinner was the one who supported Tomura the most in his want for destruction. While he had his reasons to do so when it comes to him being discriminated throughout his entire life, when given the opportunity to change towards the end of the series, he refused. He still supported Tomura even to the very end. But then, could he have even been redeemed? Possibly. Even with his initial refusal during the war, his conversation with Deku could have brought him down a similar path of redemption as another character we will be discussing later on. But unfortunately, that path ended with his rejection to change and doubling down on Tomura's villainy towards the end of the series. Which leads to the question of, was he redeemed? No. He chose to remain a villain and support Tomura to the very end. And once again, we're seeing that a lot of the villains that we're seeing haven't really gotten a redemption arc, with one major exception, Lady Nagant. So maybe the villains aren't as redeemable as we thought they were. Oh my gosh, we're about to go to Gentle Criminal. Yeah, we're going to be talking about Gentle Criminal, and I think this is just a resounding yes, yes, and yes. Should he be redeemed? Yes. Could he be redeemed? Yeah. Was he redeemed? Yeah. The crimes Gentle Criminal committed were not very bad, or not very bombastic or serious. And even in some cases, some people viewed them as beneficial. He was not a very good villain, to be honest, but he also showed a level of kindness that makes you want to see him do better. And that is seen by even the police officers looking at Gentle Criminal and actively offering him to have a second chance. And we also see that whether or not he could be redeemed, we see it through his initial conversation with Deku, as we see that he begins to change and that Deku sees that Gentle Criminal actually cares about Brava and actually sees him as more than just a villain. Gentle pretty much learned about the error of his ways and turned himself in and tried not to involve Brava, the woman that he loves, in his villainy, and was put in jail. This decision, as well as the decision to restrain the villains during the prison break, gave him the opportunity to begin his redemption alongside working with the police and the heroes. And finally, his redemption occurred. He was redeemed because he was eventually absolved of all of his crimes and eventually reunited with Brava because of the actions that he took during the final war. He put himself in life-threatening danger by helping to save Yue from falling without the thought of gaining fame or fortune. Gentle changed as a person and did everything in his power to fix the mistakes of his past, showing that he was truly redeemed and is a true hero. If anything, his redemption is probably better, if not at worst on par with characters such as Bakugo as well as Endeavor. Yeah, he is probably the best solution and best showing of a villain being redeemed in My Hero Academia, and it shows by him being one of the fan favorite villains within the entire series, barring a few members of the League of Villains. Hey, if you're seeing this, you may be wondering, hey, why did I decide that I needed to make an edit here? And that's because I once again forgot another character or villain for the list. However, the reasoning why I forgot them is because they were not as prominent as a character as the character that we talked about previously, which is Gentle Criminal. And the villain that I'm talking about is technically La Brava. And while La Brava was technically a villain, she did not feel the same type of villain role in comparison to Gentle Criminal. She was more or less a, I hate to say it, a lackey than a prominent main villain. However, if we do consider her a villain, she would be on the list, so I'll go over quickly why I would probably perceive her as a villain, and very much like Gentle Criminal, why she also went through a redemption arc and whether or not she should, could, and was redeemed. And pretty much like Gentle Criminal, it's yeses down the board. Should she be redeemed? Yes, because of the fact that while she served as a villain, she did not really commit that many massive crimes. If you ignore the fact that she was able to hack into UA as well as Feel Good Inc. And like I said, the crimes that she committed alongside Gentle Criminal were very minute and very uninspiring and really non-damaging. And the path of could she be redeemed is also yes, because of the fact that Gentle Criminal put himself as the mastermind and allowed her to no longer be associated with him. She could have lived a more relatively normal life and no longer be considered a criminal or a villain. But even then, we see that because she loves Gentle to her very core, that she's willing to do anything for him and for his freedom, which is why we later saw her working alongside the fellow heroes and the police to be able to sort of begin her path down a redemption arc, which ties into the end and the final question for La Brava of was she redeemed, and it's absolutely. She worked alongside the heroes and eventually became a hero in her own right alongside Gentle Criminal. Even to the point where, due to the actions that she took during this final war, she was able to finally be reunited with Gentle Criminal, allowing her to finally be sort of washing away her sins of being a criminal, and now that she can start a brand new life with Gentle, as we see at the end of the series where they start a brand new company that people look up to and want to be a part of due to the great actions that they did during the war. Pretty much her actions that she did during the war to sort of atone for what she did as a villain allowed her to be seen as a hero and completing her redemption arc. And speaking of the League of Villains, that's pretty much where the final chunk of the villains that we're going to be talking about are from, and starting off with Gigantomachia. And this one is probably a little bit more complex than you would think about it at first glance. Should he have been redeemed? No. While not the most intelligent member of the League of Villains, he still can know right from wrong, and he understood this and still destroyed multiple cities and was directly and indirectly responsible for a lot of deaths, including the prominent hero of Midnight. But was there a path for redemption for him? Could he have been redeemed? Actually, yes. Because we once again learned that during the final war, he's a lot smarter than you would think. With the moment of him turning against All for One, and that him doing so was his own choice and not influenced necessarily by Shinzo, this could have been the perfect opportunity for Gigantomachia to recognize what he did as wrong and try to atone for it by fighting alongside the heroes, as well as getting revenge on All for One for abandoning him. But then that ties into the idea of, was he redeemed? And unfortunately, I do not think that he was. While you could say that the actions taken by Gigantomachia during the war were very beneficial to the heroes, it's not really that it changed who he was, nor did he actively try to atone for his sins and the atrocities that he committed. Like I said, he did this because he wanted revenge on All for One, not necessarily because he wanted forgiveness or atonement for all of the destruction that he did. It was purely out of revenge. And because it was purely out of revenge and he most likely died because of it, we cannot say that he had a proper chance of actually being redeemed and therefore was not redeemed. So yeah, even characters that may not seem that they could have been redeemed could have a path for redemption, even if they didn't necessarily deserve to be redeemed or actually were redeemed. And with that idea in mind, let's talk about Dabi, aka Toya. And for Dabi, this seems to be more of a straightforward type of thing. Should he be redeemed? You would think no. Could he be redeemed? You would think no. Was he redeemed? You would think no. But I have a slightly different idea on it. So, should he be redeemed? Oh, absolutely not. Even though Dabi, aka Toya, became the way that he was by the actions of Endeavor and the invisible influences of the hero society, man still chose to kill innocent people and direct his revenge on the world and others instead of focusing on the Todoroki family. He hides behind the facade of wanting to change hero society and to really show the darknesses underneath it, but he was a hypocrite because all of it was just because of what Endeavor did or did not do when it comes to seeing who Toya was. But here's the thing, could he have been redeemed? Yes. This is the path that Spinner could have gone down with his story path. We see that Toya is fueled by anger and survived his near atomic explosion hating the Todoroki family. But even at the end, he achieved what he finally wanted, was for Endeavor and the rest of his family to see him. And after he survived, he could have learned the error of his ways and spend the last moments of his life atoning for his own action. And when it comes to whether or not he was actually redeemed, I would say yes, but really no. Don't get me wrong. When it comes to Dabi, I think that it could have been done well when it comes to his redemption. He could have learned from the conversation that he had with Endeavor as well as Shoto and began to recognize the bad that he did, the sins that he committed, and begin a path of atonement. And while he couldn't really necessarily act on them because his body was literally burnt to a crisp, I would say going down that path could have led him to a point of being redeemed. However, while we do get to see a slight change in Toya at the end of the Todoroki family plotline, the issue is that him cursing out his family did not help or show that he did not change or grow. However, the crying at the end after realizing his mistakes did show the start of an atonement, but it comes at the end of his assumed life where he cannot act on his feelings enough to actually be redeemed for everything that he did. All he could do is reflect and change within the moment without putting in enough effort to be considered redeemed or going through a redemption arc. So yeah, it's kind of the idea of too little, too late, and that maybe if he had tried to do or learned all of this earlier, or even in the final moments of his fight with Shoto and Endeavor, maybe towards the end, he could have been redeemed, but unfortunately, he did not. And with that, let's go over to a character in a similar position to Toya, which is Toga. And this one is pretty similar to Toya when it comes to their interactions and when it comes to whether or not they should, could, or were redeemed. And when it comes to Toga, should she be redeemed? In my personal opinion, no. Because very similar to Toya, she had a genetic disposition of her quirk, was fueled by the hero society, and forced her down a path of villainy. And while this allows her to be somewhat affecting her and somewhat deserving of sympathy, however, her killing of innocent people indiscriminately, even under her circumstances, is too many people and couldn't be unforgivable of being redeemed. However, could she be redeemed? Absolutely. Because there's a way that Toga, through seeing the lens Uraraka went through to save her, could have put her on a path of being redeemed, especially with her sacrifice of saving Uraraka towards the end of the series. And you would think that with that sacrifice, she definitely was redeemed at the end of the story. However, I don't think so, because Toga was so close to potentially being redeemed. She made a sacrifice of her life to save Uraraka, which was, in my opinion, very heroic. She began to overcome her flaws and realizing the truth in Uraraka's words and her actions. She even accepted Uraraka's feelings and even recognized the good she could have done with her quirk in another life. However, Toga never shows regret for her actions and in a way doubles down like twice. She still chooses to be a villain at the end instead of accepting the responsibility and consequences of her actions, such as going to jail. By doing that, she was unable to be redeemed, and in a similar vein as Twice, while they are good people at heart, they chose to still be villains, which means that they couldn't be redeemed. So yeah, if anything, what I'm showing you is just how complex many of these villains are, which is more that you can say about other shonen series. And the fact that you can have multiple villains come close to being redeemed, and some villains actually being redeemed, is really proves to why the villains of My Hero Academia are just great characters in their own right. And even more controversially, we have someone that could be considered a stain on the villainy of My Hero Academia, which is Stain. And going down the list when it comes to Stain, many people would argue that when it comes to Stain's ideologies, they're stupid, they suck, he's a bad villain. But I would beg to differ, especially because I read Vigilantes. And so when it comes to whether or not Stain should be redeemed, no. While Stain's ideology is to show the world what heroes should be and how they shouldn't be heroes for monetary gain, fame, and fortune, how he went about it is just very much unacceptable and flawed. He killed heroes for doing their job, but also attempted to kill truly innocent and altruistic heroes such as Ingenium, aka Ida's brother Tensei. From what you see with Vigilantes, he doesn't become a hero just for the fame and fortune, but because he actually wants to help people. And while with Ida, he wanted to be a hero just because it runs in his blood and because his brother was a hero and he looks up to his brother, Ida didn't really have that mentality of heroics, but his brother did. And the fact that his brother was paralyzed for just being a hero, and being a hero that Stain should have accepted, it really just shows that what he was doing was very much unacceptable and why people perceive it as being stupid, because it was heavily flawed by who Stain was as a person, who is a flawed person. But even with that flaw, could he have been redeemed? Maybe. Towards the end of the series, Stain saw that the kid that he tried to kill decided to continue to embody the ideas of All Might. This could have been a very waking up moment, calling to begin for Stain to change and obtain atonement and therefore be redeemed. However, was he redeemed? No. And we see that with his conversation with All Might. He told All Might to come and kill him because he is in fact the man that killed so many people. By the fact that he declares for All Might to come and kill him as Stain and for the actions that he committed shows that he really chose to remain as Stain and wanted to remain as Stain. He showed really no remorse to the people that he killed and didn't even feel sorry for what he did even when he died. Because instead of just praying or hoping that All Might could forgive him for what he did or even repenting for his action, he still committed to the same ideology and heroic praise of All Might that he did towards the beginning of the series as he does towards the end, pretty much showing that he really didn't change as a character or as a person and why he was not redeemed at the end. This is a little bit more embarrassing, but I left out another prominent villain when it comes to this entire video about villain redemptions, and it's potentially another villain that you could argue almost got redeemed, and that's Kurogiri, aka Oburo Shirakumo. And I'll go over it very briefly because for the most part, while yes, he was a villain, he didn't really have the chance to have his own autonomy due to the fact that he was also partially a Nomu. But going first, should he have been redeemed? Potentially yes, because of the fact that he was basically a living corpse, a living Nomu, and was only doing what he was programmed to do while also having the memories and like the actual heroic spirit of Oburo Shirakumo. The actions that he took were directly tied to who he was, as well as him trying to help and serve Tomura Shigaraki, which ties into the idea of could he have been redeemed, to which the answer is yes, because we did see that while he was Kurogiri, he was also Shirakumo, which means that he still had that heroic spirit inside of him, and we saw that characters such as Aizawa as well as Present Mike were able to break into Kurogiri to claw out the Oburo that was always inside of him, which was the reasoning why the heroes were able to use Warp Gate to their advantage, and even towards the end where you have Kurogiri recognizing that he is on the side of Aizawa when it came to having all of the portals open up and bring the heroes to the final battleground against All For One. However, the idea of was he redeemed is most likely than not no, because while yes, he was also Oburo Shirakumo, the previous hero and friend to Aizawa and present Mike Yamada, towards the end, he was still very much Kurogiri, because he was still Kurogiri to the end, which means he wanted to protect Tomura Shigaraki no matter what. So he still, in a way, was both a hero, but towards the end chose to stay and remain a villain and help the villains even upon his death. So unfortunately, because of that, he didn't get the process of being fully redeemed, so unfortunately he was not redeemed at the end of his life. And now, hopefully, I haven't forgotten any other characters. And now we're finally down to the final 3 villains that we need to talk about when it comes to whether or not they've been redeemed. Why am I holding up 3 fingers? When did I change shirts? I forgot to put Aoyama in this video. So, Aoyama. Do I really need to explain why he's going to be on the list and why he's yes in every single question? Well, I don't have to, but I'm going to do it anyway. So, should Aoyama be redeemed? Yes. Aoyama was basically forced to serve under All For One because his parents basically made a deal with the devil. He was technically a villain because he was a traitor, but we've seen throughout the entire story that he did not let that really define or really change what he wanted to do, which is to be a hero. And this ties into, could he be redeemed, which is a resounding yes as well. Because while he was a traitor for All For One and conveyed information about what was going on with the students and what was going on at UA, we saw that he was still very much conflicted with it, and that when All For One stopped giving him orders, he was finally able to achieve the perceived dream that he wanted to. But he eventually fell back when All For One came back into the forefront, and we see that the path that he could have taken is abandoning the ideals and the wants of All For One and going more towards the side of the heroes. And the final question, was he redeemed? Absolutely. We've seen throughout the story that Aoyama, while still being a traitor and perceived as a villain in the offset of the traitor reveal, he still did a lot of heroic stuff that, if All For One knew about, would have definitely crucified him for. He felt guilt and remorse for all of the pain that he caused. Even to the point when he was arrested and towards the end of the series, he still chose to leave UA as a form of punishment for the wrong that he did, and that he didn't deserve, that he could have been a hero alongside his fellow Class A members. And for the most part, he is redeemed. He made a great sacrifice of no longer being a hero. He joined the side of good and even betrayed All For One. He was a crucial reasoning for why the heroes were able to turn the tide and even have a chance of defeating All For One in the final war. And once again, he was feeling guilt and wanted to atone for all of the horrible actions that he did. He looked so much down upon himself that it had to take literally the entire class rooting for him to realize that he could be a hero even after everything that he's done. And at the end, you could say that he did have an atonement arc, because he did switch to the side of good and became a true hero from his villainous ways. Alright, back to what I was talking about beforehand. I'm so sorry, Aoyama. I shouldn't have forgotten about you. And now we're getting towards the final 2 villains of the series, and when it comes to whether or not they were redeemed. And the second to last is All For One / Tomura All For One. And let's just be real. This may be the most complex, most nuanced take on a character when it comes to redemption. Could he? No. He couldn't be redeemed, he shouldn't be redeemed, and he was not redeemed. The answer to all three of those questions is a long and resounding no. It could take an entire video to cover all of the crimes All For One did. From murder, theft, drug distribution, blackmail, human experimentation, racketeering, the list goes on. And he did all of this evil for the selfish reason of reclaiming his brother he viewed as his property in a twisted form of love. So yeah, there was no way he could, should, or was redeemed by the end of the story. And he died the most perfect death. A pathetic one for a pathetic character who deserves nothing less than death. But hey, that's just my opinion. And speaking of opinions, you probably have the most fan-favorite villain outside of Twice when it comes to the My Hero Academia fandom. And you would know that if you look at the Twitter stands of the villains on Twitter. Now, we're going to be talking about Tomura Shigaraki. And let's start off. Should Tomura Shigaraki have been redeemed? No. Well, we later learned that Tomura's life, hatred, and want for destruction was all but nearly manifested and created by All For One. Tomura still had some autonomy in his decision making. While he was a victim of society in All For One, he was also a perpetrator of mass destruction and murder. Whether on purpose or not, he has so much blood on his hands that he can't easily be redeemed. However, could he have been redeemed? Yes. By the fact that Tomura was a puppet, an argument can be made that he made no decisions of his own. So a redemption could be made by him making a choice, like a sacrifice, of the want to repent, and lead him to want to repent and atone for his actions, whether intentional or unintentional, which could lead him down a path of redemption in the distant future as long as he serves his life sentence and helps create a better world. Or heck, making a grand sacrifice that puts him firmly on the side of heroics could have been a path he could have taken to be redeemed by sacrificing himself to both end the bloodline of One For All For One, and the power struggle that lasted over decades. However, was he redeemed? No. Even with the path presented, and it being so close to being followed within the story of My Hero Academia, and how nearly all of his actions were placed on the back of All For One, Tomura still chose to be a villain and even embraced the villain moniker even on his deathbed. The proof that Tomura Shigaraki did change but still chose to be a villain lies in his final words to Deku to Spinner. Even to the bitter end, Tomura Shigaraki kept fighting to destroy. Even if you want to translate it as Tomura Shigaraki viewing himself separate from the Tomura Shigaraki in that statement, even prior to that, with his conversation with Deku and him becoming a child in the Vestige world, he dedicated himself that even if his hatred went away, even if he couldn't continue on the path of destruction, that he still needed to be a hero to the villains, and by doing so, remaining a villain himself. His declaration to be a hero to the villains cemented the fact that Tomura chose not to atone, change, grow, and by extension, be redeemed. Tomura, to the bitter end, fought to be a villain, and he succeeded. And that's why he could not be redeemed. But yeah, oh gosh, this is going to be a very long video, and it is. And this is something that I really want to talk about because this is something that I've seen in the My Hero Academia when it comes to arguments and even things that I've talked about when it comes to the villains. And while yes, they are very empathetic, I really want to talk about and discuss both the good and the bad when it comes to the villains. And that the best way to talk about is with redemption. Because redemption can't happen unless a character has done both good and bad, evil and good. And it matters because whether or not you're a villain or a hero, we've seen in My Hero Academia that both sides can and have been redeemed from their sins, their actions, their evil and wrongdoing. And that what makes you enjoy the characters can be the nuances of their redemption or their character growth that may involve it. And that we've seen personally in the community how many people seem to only focus on like the sympathetic aspects of the villains, but not really focus on them as a whole. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with this video. Focus on the villains as a whole through redemption to see what they are in their core and their completeness. But yeah, that's really what I wanted to do with this video. And hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully I made it as enjoyable as possible. And let me ask you this. Do you think that there are any of the villains listed that actually could have been redeemed? Maybe leave your thoughts and explanations down below and maybe I can read them. As well as don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to see more content like this. Do all that cool jazz. Hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!